Alright, hi guys. This is a quick video on domain and range just to kind of review some skills that we already have. And although domain and range is a fairly easy concept, it can get pretty confusing, to be honest. So here's what we know. Domain is referring to all the x values of a function. And range refers to all the y values. So all the y values in a function. And we want to be able to basically describe the x values and describe the y values. So there's more than one way we can do this. We can do it using inequalities, and we can do it using interval notation. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Let's do an example and just kind of practice. So example 1. How about the function f of x equals x squared? That's a typical graph that we all kind of know. We know that it's a parabola. So I'm going to sketch the graph so we can kind of talk about it a little bit. Here's the parabola. And this is y equals x squared. And I'm not even going to put any numbers on here yet. So domain and range is a way to describe the x and the y values. So if you think about this graph, you can think about it visually, like a lot of people like, or you can think about it in a table, a little XY table. And remember when you first learned how to graph, how you would pick numbers for the x and you would basically plug them into the function and get an answer. Like, I'll plug in -2, so it's going to be -2 squared, which is 4. I'll plug in -1, it'll be -1 squared, which is 1. I'll plug in 0, 0 squared is 0. And you could just keep on going, and then you would plug in 1, and it'd be 1 squared is 1. You would take all these points and you'd put them on the graph. So like -2, 4, so -2 must be up here, which is at 4. And you'd plot all the points and connect them to figure out what the graph looks like. Well, that's essentially going to help you figure out domain and range. If domain is all the x values, then it's all the numbers in this table. What can you not put in the table? That's what you should ask yourself. What numbers can you not put into this graph? Are there any numbers you're not allowed to square? You can obviously square a negative, you can square positives, you can use 0. If I had picked any decimals, like if I had done like 0.25, isn't that okay? I could have done 0.25 squared, and that would have been fine. I could do really big numbers. I could do, 1,000 and do 1,000 squared, and then have to plot that on my graph. I can't think of any number I'm not allowed to do. So if I had to describe the domain, I'd say, well, since I can put all numbers in, I would say the domain is all real numbers. Domain is going to be called all real numbers. And we say all real numbers just like this. Or we use that symbol that looks like all real numbers, which you guys have probably seen before. If I was going to use interval notation means that I'm going to describe all real numbers using infinities. So I would say it goes from -infinity to +infinity. And we'd put parentheses around this. We always use parentheses around infinities. So there's my domain. The range is the y values. So now let's talk about the y values. That's the other side of the table here. And what kind of numbers come out? So we see we got all different numbers here. 4, 1, 0, 1. This would have been a decimal, and this is a really large number. Something I'm noticing is they're all positive numbers. 0 is the smallest number here. If you look at the graph and you're thinking y values, here's the y-axis going straight up and down. Notice there's nothing down below here in the negative numbers. It starts at 0 and goes up. So my range is starting at 0 and going up. So to describe that, I could say, well, the y values are greater than or equal to 0. That would be one way. If I want to use interval notation, I'd say, well, it goes from 0 up to infinity. And infinities always get a parenthesis. You have to decide if you're going to use a parenthesis or a bracket here. So because 0 is included, there's a solid point on the graph, and it's in the table up here. I'm going to use a bracket. A bracket would make sense. And then there's my domain and range. So it gets a little trickier when we start talking about functions that we don't have memorized. And I'm going to give you an example here, example 2. Let's say you had f of x equals 3 over x minus 2. So we could spend some time building a table and drawing a graph and figuring this out. But if I just asked you the domain off the top of your head, you could kind of figure it out. To be honest, you'd look at this and say, okay, well, domain is all the x values. So am I allowed to plug in like negative numbers, -3, -5? Yeah, sure, I could do that. Can I plug in positive numbers like 7, 10, 20? Can I plug in decimals? All these things are working. If you want, make a little XY table and even test it out if you're not comfortable. If you're like, I don't know, can I plug in -3? Let's try it. That would be 3 over -3 minus 2. So that's 3 over -5. That's okay. It's just a fraction, but it works. I could plug in positive numbers, do the same thing. What number can I not plug in? What number is going to give me trouble? Well, I don't want 0 in the bottom of a fraction. So if I plugged in 2, I'd have 3 over 2 minus 2, which is 0. And 3 over 0 is undefined and it doesn't work. So this is my number that I'm worried about, 2. I think that's the only number though. Can you plug everything else in? Sure. So my domain is going to be all real numbers except x cannot equal 2. That's the one number it can't equal. Now in interval notation, we're going to say it's every single number but 2. So we're going to write it like this. We're going to say it goes from -infinity all the way to 2. But then it stops. That's the one number that's not okay. And then it goes from 2 to positive infinity, and all those numbers are okay. And parentheses for the infinities, parenthesis for the 2 because the 2 was not okay. Does that make sense? So it goes -infinity to 2. There must be like a blank spot on the graph there, a hole or something. And then 2 to infinity. So another good example for a domain problem, example 3, would be the graph of y equals the square root of 49 minus x squared. Hopefully you kind of remember what this graph looks like. You might need to test it out, put it in the calculator, or maybe make a table. This is one of these graphs that looks like a half circle. The square root of 49 is positive and -7. So it's a graph that goes from positive and -7. And it basically looks like this. And it goes up to 7. It's a little half circle. And if I was going to make a little XY table and plug in some points, think about the things that you can't plug in. I know I can plug in -7, because -7 would be square root 49 minus -7 squared. So think about what that is. -7 squared is 49. So we have square root 49 minus 49, which is 0. So this whole thing is 0. And that's why there's a point at -7, 0. So that makes sense. I could plug in numbers in between here. Like, let's plug in 0. It'd be square root 49 minus 0 squared. So that's the square root of 49, which is 7. Okay, so it's right up here. Here's where the issue happens. Plug in a number that's outside of this domain that we're talking about. Like, go out here to like -10, or out here to +10. So -10, I'll put it on top, +10 down here. If you try plugging in those numbers, think about what's going to happen. Square root 49 minus -10 squared. We know 10 squared is 100. So we're going to have square root 49 minus 100. And 49 minus 100, we're looking at a negative number. What is that? -51. So the square root of -51. That's where your red flag happens. I don't know if you can see my negative sign right there. But you can't take a square root of a negative number. It's imaginary. And everything we do in calculus, we avoid imaginary numbers. So that's a red flag. That's not going to work. And it's going to be the same thing if you plug in +10. you're going to get 10 squared is 100. You're going to get another negative number. So this one's not going to work either. So my domain is really limited. I can't go out to these numbers. So when I write my domain, I say I'm trapped kind of between -7 and +7. Those are the only numbers I can put in my table. So from -7 to +7. Use parentheses if these numbers can't go in. But look, -7 went in and it was okay. So I'm going to bracket this one and bracket this one because there's solid points here, not a hole. The range is the y values that come out of this. And look at, the range was really short. The y values, I got all positive numbers and it went from 0 up to 7. So my range goes from 0 to 7. And again, brackets because there's points at those spots. So just don't forget how domain and range is just describing x and y values, and being really careful about thinking about what numbers can x be and what numbers can x not be. So hopefully that helps refresh your memory a little bit.